Today I am meeting with Dr. Craig Childress, and he's there on your screen, as you can see. And so without any further interruptions or any delay, I'll just have Dr. Childress introduce himself. And Dr. Childress, please give your contact information if you'd be so kind, and I'll ask for that at the end of the interview as well for people that find that you can be of help to them or that may wish to contact you for your services.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for hosting me here today.
Oh, I'm grateful you could do so.
Yeah. So I'm Dr. Craig Childress. I'm a clinical psychologist out here in the Los Angeles area in California. My email address is drcraigchildress.com at gmail.com. And you can also reach me through that email address through my website. And my phone number is 909-821-5398. And a little bit about my background. I'm a clinical psychologist. I specialized mostly in child and family therapy, parent-child conflicts, marital problems, angry, grumpy kids, and ADHD. More recently, I've become involved in a type of pathology that most people call parental alienation in high-conflict divorce, although that's not necessarily a defined term in clinical psychology. And so from a clinical psychology perspective, it's a different type of pathology that we're talking about.
So we are specifically going to talk about parental alienation, and you are far more familiar with it than I, because I'm a divorced lawyer. But there's people that talk about parental alienation syndrome, and then people that just talk about parental alienation. And we're not here to talk about or to debate that. We're here to talk about the pathology that a lot of people do in the vernacular refer to as parental alienation.
Right.
And in the course of this, we'll discuss what kind of behavior that is,
right,
without actually trying to give it an official name, because that is something of a matter of controversy already, right?
To a certain extent, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so you have attracted attention for many reasons, one of which is your book, The Attachment-Based Model of Parental Alienation. Mm-hmm. And so I've watched your videos, and if those of you seeing this have not, they're very helpful. They're very enlightening, and in some cases even surprising, sometimes pleasantly surprising, because you'll learn that you're not alone if you're feeling a certain way. But tell us a little bit about how you say this is not a new syndrome. It's been falsely identified as such, and explain what you mean by that, please.
Right. Well, back in the mid-1980s, psychiatrist Richard Gardner identified a type of pathology associated with high-conflict divorce. But then, in my view, Dr. Gardner was not a very good diagnostician. He too quickly abandoned the established and accepted principles and constructs of professional psychology, and he proposed that this pathology that he was talking about, or that he recognized, was a new syndrome within all of mental health. And he proposed that it was identifiable by a set of 8 unique and uniquely developed symptom identifiers. And that began a whole controversy surrounding this type of family pathology, whether a new syndrome existed or whether it didn't exist, or and how to identify it. And when I first ran across it, now I'm a clinical psychologist working with children and families, and I recognized it as it was totally within the standard and established constructs of professional psychology. And what I recognized was that it wasn't a new syndrome necessarily. It just simply had not been properly diagnosed. And so what I went back and did was I worked out the diagnosis of it. And because it was very controversial, I wanted to work it out at a very fine-grained level to describe it entirely within standard and established and fully accepted psychological principles and constructs. And so that's where I developed the model of an attachment-based model of parental alienation that I describe in my book, Foundations. And this particular model, I refer to as an attachment-based model to differentiate it from Gardner's previous model that he called parental alienation syndrome.
I guess what I wanted to ask at this point is, should we flesh out a little bit what attachment-based means then, as to how that is the diagnosis?
I describe it in my book. It's a complex pathology, and there's several different ways to look at it. Primarily, what's involved is it's a pathology having to do with parental personality disorder dynamics. The parent essentially has a narcissistic or borderline personality traits, prominent traits of a narcissistic borderline personality, which are extremely vulnerable to collapsing when involved in divorce and the rejection and abandonment inherent to divorce. And so this pathology of the parent collapses when they're rejected around the divorce, and they engage the child in what's called a role reversal relationship, where they use the child to meet their own needs. Technically, it's called a role reversal relationship, where the child is used as a regulatory object to stabilize the pathology of the parent. And this pathology, this narcissistic borderline personality pathology, actually has its origins deeper in the childhood trauma of the attachment system of this parent that produced the personality disorder dynamics. And so, to a certain degree, it is the transgenerational transmission of attachment trauma from the childhood of what's called the alienating parent to the current child and the current family relationships. So, while superficially it appears to be a very complex kind of process, it's always pretty much the same. So once people begin to become familiar with it, begin to become familiar with the personality disorder aspects of it, the attachment disorder aspects of it, the family systems pathology associated with it, it becomes more familiar and understandable to people. But essentially, everything is within standard and established psychological principles and constructs. It's not a new syndrome within mental health.
I am not a mental health professional, but when I hear about things such as parental alienation syndrome or parental alienation and Gardner's ideas, I think a lot of us, or when we hear about borderline personality disorder or other things like that, we hear about, like, well, some of the traits are that they get into reckless behavior and they do this and they do that. Is one of the improper diagnoses that Dr. Gardner made was that when certain people get divorced, they show this, when in fact that's not really the case. It's an outgrowth of an already existing pathology. Do you see what I'm asking?
The error that Dr. Gardner made was by proposing a new syndrome that's unique in all of mental health and is attached to no other type of pathology with a unique set of symptom identifiers. He didn't apply the professional rigor necessary to apply standard and existing psychological principles and constructs to make a proper diagnosis of what the pathology is. It's actually surrounding personality disorder dynamics. You can look at it from an attachment system perspective. You can also look at it from a family systems perspective.
Now, do you deal with people who try to discredit your work by saying that you are piggybacking off of Dr. Gardner's more inaccurate work? I mean, because it seems to me like it would be a cheap shot that an attorney could easily take, is to say, don't listen to Dr. Childress because he's one of those parental alienation syndrome people, right, which of course the courts wouldn't realize there's any distinctions at all, or even whether you call it syndrome or not, that parental alienation itself, some people think, doesn't even exist.
Right.
There's parents that may not like each other, but there's no actual alienation going on. It's just maybe symptomatic of other normal things that happen. So you mentioned in the notes that you gave me in advance, what are some of the things that make your what is it that makes your theory something that's more bankable from an evidence and a litigation basis? Not because I'm interested in being pugnacious and vexatious and all that, but people, I think, need to understand that Dr. Childress can say, look, I actually have something that exists based upon current diagnostic criteria, mm-hmm, and I can show you that this is a problem without me having to invent any new terminology or, like you say, some new syndrome. Could you explain that a little bit to us as to what you look for and how you can diagnose this in the family?
Right. First, with regard to parental alienation syndrome and Gardner and that whole model, I am not an advocate of that at all. I believe the Gardnerian PAS model is a bad model. I have never advocated for it. I do not believe it should be accepted. I think it's weak. I think it's problematic in a number of ways. And I've discussed this on my blog and on my book as well.
But do you see people trying to smear you with a broad brush, though?
Yes, and I have to correct them.
Thank you.
From a clinical psychology perspective, the term parental alienation has no meaning. It's not a defined term within clinical psychology. The proper term in clinical psychology for this type of pathology is called pathogenic parenting. Pathopathology, genic creation. So that's the creation of significant pathology in the child through severely distorted and aberrant parenting practices. The term pathogenic parenting has a substantial history and substantial literature base in both clinical psychology and developmental psychology. It was also referenced in the DSM-4, the Diagnostic Manual, 4th edition, with regard to an attachment disorder, since attachment systems never spontaneously dysfunction. They always are dysfunctions are always a product of pathogenic parenting. And so what we're looking at here is not sort of a bad parenting. What we're looking at is that this parent is producing significant psychopathology in the child through aberrant and distorted parenting practices.
When we think about pathogenic parenting prior to the popularity that Dr. Gardner attracted and that attracted your attention and your criticism, what are some other examples of pathogenic parenting that the mental health community was more or less in agreement on? Like, is that things like Munchausen by proxy syndrome, or is that not?
Well, that's another syndrome that is still controversial, less so, but still somewhat.
What's some examples of garden variety pathogenic parenting before we got to the parental alienation idea?
Let's take, for example, in the DSM-4, they had a reactive attachment disorder where the parent would be extraordinarily neglectful or extraordinarily hostile and aggressive to the child and severely disrupt the child's attachment bonding to the parent or to anybody. So the child would bond indiscriminately to anybody or wouldn't bond to anybody. So that reactive attachment disorder is a response to pathogenic parenting. More often it's used around role reversal relationships, where the parent is using the child to meet the parent's needs. In healthy parent-child relationships, the parent meets the child's needs. The parent responds to the child in ways that helps the child grow and develop and stabilize their sense of self. In role reversal or pathogenic parenting, the parent uses a child to stabilize the parent's psychological state, and that's referred to using the child as a regulatory object for the parent.
Well, that doesn't sound like that requires this parent with attachment disorder to alienate kids from the other parent. So how does that manifest itself and why?
With regard to the pathology that most people talk about is around parental alienation, we have a narcissistic borderline personality parent. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the full disorder. It can be significant traits.
Oh, and let me interrupt there. We're talking about parental alienation in lowercase letters, just for lack of a better term, because it is descriptive, if not a term of art, right?
Yes, I use it mostly because it's within the cultural vernacular to describe this.
Okay. And so do I. All right. So, you're talking about, it's like, wait a minute, why can't this person just have a problem, and why does it manifest itself in alienating the children's affections for the other parent? Can't they still get role reversal without having to have mom or dad?
Well, actually, let me shift gears a little bit over to family systems literature. Salvador Minuchin, Jay Haley, the whole literature about family systems therapy. This is amply recognized within family systems. What it's called within family systems is the child is being triangulated into the spousal conflict by the formation of what's called a cross-generational coalition with one parent against the other parent. Salvador Minuchin identified it and described it. Jay Haley identified it and described it. It's a cross-generational coalition with one parent against the other parent. And what happens in this cross-generational coalition is the allied parent is redirecting their anger at the other spouse through the child. This is extraordinarily common in family systems. I see it
not only is it common, but I can easily understand that as you describe that.
And I've seen it in normal range divorces, everything's fine. And so it's not an unusual pathology to see. There's two types of triangulation. That's one of them, is using this cross-generational coalition. The difference in what people describe as parental alienation is when you add the narcissistic borderline personality traits to the allied parent, it takes on a particularly malignant and virulent form that seeks to entirely terminate the child's relationship with the other parent. In just normal range garden variety cross-generational coalitions, the conflict with the targeted parent increases, but the child doesn't seek to terminate the relationship. When you add the narcissistic borderline pathology, that seeks to terminate the child's relationship. And it's because of a particular trait of the narcissistic borderline personality called splitting, which is an extreme perception of all good, all bad. They cannot maintain a middle ground. So the moment the ex-spouse, the spouse becomes an ex-spouse, they must also become an ex-parent. So the ex-husband must become an ex-wife, or the ex-wife must become an ex-mother, and the ex-husband must become an ex-father. And that's specific to the pathology of the narcissistic borderline personality.
When diagnosing this, again, parental alienation in lowercase letters, do you, and you meaning anyone in your position, do you diagnose both the suspected parent and the children? Is that how it's done?
Now, that's where I would shift away from the term parental alienation in lowercase letters.
Whatever
term you what I'm interested in is pathogenic parenting.
Okay.
So if I got a bad parent, I really don't care as long as the child's okay. It's when the child develops significant psychopathology. Now I have the parent inducing significant psychopathology in the child in order to meet the parent's needs.
Can you diagnose that pathology through the child alone, or do you have to observe both parent and child?
It can be diagnosed entirely through the child's symptoms.
Can you figure out which parent is the pathogenic parent?
Yes.
Without. Okay.
And here's the situation. Once we understand what the pathology is, the attachment pathology, the personality pathology, the family systems pathology with this, we know where we can begin to look for distinctive diagnostic indicators. And there's three very distinctive and definitive diagnostic indicators that all must be there. The first is that there's a complete suppression of the child's attachment bonding motivations towards a normal range and affectionately available parent. So I've got a normal range parent, which is a pretty broad range, but the child...
Meaning you can be a pretty bad parent and still be pretty normal? Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, consider what we see in normal parents. Okay, parents get angry at their kids. Parents have conflicts with their kids. That's normal range. But not physically abusive or sexual abuse or any sort of really severely aberrant. So you have a suppression of the child's attachment bonding. That is extremely unusual. When you have a bad parent, the child actually bonds more strongly to the bad parent because it has to do with the attachment system being a predator-driven system. It protects children from predators. If you have a bad parent, you're being exposed to the predation. So the child is actually more motivated to bond to a bad parent. That's called an insecure attachment. But here we have a child rejecting a parent. That's not how the attachment system works. So that's the first indicator that, wow, this is something very unusual because it's not consistent with the normal range functioning of the child's attachment system. The second is there's a characteristic set of 5 specific narcissistic borderline personality traits being displayed by the child. A grandiose judgment of the targeted parent, where the child sits in an elevated status above the parent judging them. A sense of entitlement, that parent is supposed to meet that child's needs to the child's satisfaction. And if the child's needs aren't met to the child's satisfaction, the child feels entitled to punish the parent. There's an absence of empathy for the targeted parent. And that's extremely both disturbing and characteristic. The child has no empathy for the targeted parent or for the feelings of the targeted parent. There's only 3 disorders that have an absence of empathy: autism, sociopathic, or narcissistic personalities. And the sociopath, no, the child's not a sociopath, the child's not autistic, narcissistic. A haughty and arrogant attitude of contempt and rejection for the targeted parent, and then that splitting where the targeted parent is all bad and the allied parent is all good. So you have this characteristic set of narcissistic borderline personality symptoms. I describe these as the psychological fingerprints of the control by the narcissistic parent on the child. We cannot psychologically control a child without leaving psychological fingerprints of our control. And so the child's expressing those narcissistic symptoms, not because the child has a narcissistic personality, but because the child's being influenced by a parent who has a narcissistic personality.
Now, Dr. Childress, I don't know how much experience you have as an expert witness, but I presume that you have done so. Is that correct? What do you find, how well received does your testimony get in general?
It's variable at this point, depending upon the judge. Some judges give it more weight than others. My concern at this point, though, isn't the legal system. My concern is the mental health system, because this is standard pathology.
Right, I'm on the same wavelength as you are. Huh? I'm sorry. Go right ahead.
Well, all mental health professionals should be assessing for the pathology, and if it's present, they should be properly diagnosing it. The third diagnostic symptom is a fixed and false belief that the child holds relative to the targeted parent, that the targeted parent is somehow abusive of the child. And this is a normal range, affectionately available parent, but the child has a fixed and false belief that this parent is abusive of the child. That's called a delusion. The child has a psychotic delusional belief. This is a very serious form of pathology that a lot of mental health professionals are absolutely missing.
And does the belief manifest itself in in allegations that are false, or just a belief without being able to articulate?
It can go either way. The child might say, the parent is abusive towards me, and when you explore why, it's because they took away their iPhone. That's not abusive. Right. Or because, they didn't spend enough time with me before the divorce. That's not abusive. And so it's a fixed and false belief. And where that comes from is this false trauma narrative in the narcissistic borderline parent in the pattern of abusive parent, victimized child, protective parent. That's in the psychological makeup called internal working models of the narcissistic borderline parent. And they're imposing that on the child. They're getting the child to take on the role of the victimized child in this false trauma reenactment. The child's not victimized. The targeted parent isn't abusive. The narcissistic borderline parent isn't protective. It's all a kabuki theater of false drama that is presented and displayed to people, and the child is playing the role of the victimized child. But when you actually explore it, there's no there. The child is not a victimized child, and that's what makes it a delusional belief that the actual delusion is in the parent. That's the carrier of the delusion.
Because this is so, like, as you say, it's just a kabuki theater of false, of fictitious stories. I mean, I'm sure you've seen this too, because you work in the mental health realm, and then you see people that will say, well, those tears seem genuine, whether it be a divorce or a rape or whatever it is, and you must just bang your head against a wall going, yes, they look very genuine, right. But they are because this person is sick, not because this person's a genuine victim. How do you protect a child from this, since it's not something that's widely accepted? We can take a child who's got a black eye and bring that child into protective custody. We can take a child who's got welts on his back. How do you persuade people that this is a child who needs to be protected? Again, with taking it out of the legal realm, how do we protect children? And then secondly, as we wrap up, how do you treat a child who has been pretty immersed in this pathogenic parenting that some people will refer to as parental alienation, but we are making that distinction. So how do you protect them originally? How can you get protection immediately, if at all? And what have you seen that works? And then what do you do to treat a child?
First, all mental health professionals must assess for this particular type of pathology the collapse of a narcissistic borderline personality parent surrounding divorce. Up on my website, there's a diagnostic checklist that they can use to just assess for the 3 diagnostic indicators, and there's a bunch of associated clinical signs. I would recommend that mental health professionals begin reading Foundations to understand the origins of this pathology. This is not a theory. This is called diagnosis. It's using established and fully accepted psychological principles and constructs. Second, once we assess for this, normal parent-child conflict, then you say, aren't the child's symptoms real? When if the targeted parent is really a bad parent or really a nasty parent, the child does not show haughty and arrogant attitude towards this parent. The child does not show a sense of entitlement towards this parent. Oftentimes doesn't show that absence of empathy towards the parent. So the child doesn't display the full array of symptoms. Plus the child's beliefs that that's a bad parent isn't delusional. But when you have all 3 of those symptoms, you have a parent inducing significant developmental pathology, the diagnostic indicator 1 about the attachment system, personality disorder pathology, diagnostic indicator 2, and a delusional psychiatric pathology in the child in order to meet the needs of the parents. That represents a DSM-5 diagnosis of V995.51 child psychological abuse confirmed. And so the first thing mental health professionals need to begin doing is assessing and making the proper and accurate diagnosis of pathology as child psychological abuse confirmed. Once mental health professionals begin making an accurate diagnosis of the pathology, then how do we treat or deal with any form of child abuse? We separate the child from the abusive parent. We separate the child from a physically abusive parent. We separate the child from a sexually abusive parent. We separate the child from a psychologically abusive parent. Then, once we have the child in a safe, protected environment, that they're no longer being psychologically abused or sexually abused or physically abused, we then begin to treat the child for the consequences of that abuse. And we demand, actually, that the abusive parent go get therapy to develop insight into how and why they were abusing the child before we restore the child to that parent to protect the child from being re-exposed to the abuse. That's how we treat child abuse.
One quick question. How does cutting this child off from one of its parents help that child?
Okay, let me frame that. If the child is being sexually abused, how does cutting that child off from the sexually abusive parent help that child? That's a ludicrous question.
But you see it before.
Pause when a child is being abused from protecting the child. This is not a child custody issue. Absolutely, this is not a child custody issue. This is a child protection issue. This is pathogenic parenting inducing severe developmental pathology, personality pathology, and psychiatric delusional pathology in the child in order to meet the needs of a narcissistic borderline parent. This is not a child custody issue. We protect the child. We balance and restore the child. Once we have recovered the authentic, healthy child, we can then reintegrate the child back to the abusive parent. Hopefully that parent's gotten therapy. If they haven't, there's things we can do to help stabilize and protect the child. We want the child, children love both parents. We want the child to have a relationship with both parents. So we will reintroduce the child to the abusive parent, but we will take the steps necessary to make sure that the pathology of the narcissistic borderline parent does not reinflict the psychological abuse on the child and destroy the child's development.
Dr. Childress, I appreciate you taking the time with me and also so clearly explaining things and so bracingly. I've come away from this far better informed and with a better perspective on how this pathogenic parenting functions, what it is and what it is not.
I'd like to make one more comment.
And the distinctions from parental alienations are particularly helpful because it's getting us clear.
Yeah.
The floor is yours.
About the legal system. The legal system cannot step up and do its function until the mental health system steps up and does its function. we cannot litigate family problems. That the proper domain for this is in mental health. Mental health needs to assess and diagnose the pathology. And when mental health then comes to the legal system with a clear diagnosis and a clear treatment recommendation, the legal system will then be able to act with the clarity and decisiveness necessary to protect the child.
Perfect way to conclude this. And again, I thank you for that. For those who would like to know more, would you please talk about what the book is? I assume it's available on Amazon and bookstores. Yeah. So you tell us about the book and your any contact information you'd like to share with those who may want to go to your website or consult with you, please.
Okay. So I have a blog that they can go to and read, as well as there's information up on my website, various handouts and checklists and things that are resources for people. The book is an attachment-based model of parental alienation foundations. It lays out the theoretical foundations for this particular model of the pathology. There's also a small booklet that's called an attachment-based model of parental alienation, single case ABAB assessment and remedy. It's an option that parents or attorneys can provide to the court for assessment or remedy of this particular type of pathology. I have a couple of online lecture seminars available through California Southern University. They're master's lecture series. You can Google California Southern University and Dr. Childress, and those will come up. And in addition, I offer professional-to-professional consultation to other mental health professionals that if they reach a case like this and just want to reach out and have an hour consultation by Skype, I offer those, at least at this point, free of charge because I don't want to get too overwhelmed. But at this point, I do want to encourage professional consultation on this. So if family members can find a therapist in their area that's willing to consult with me, or if therapists were willing to consult with me, I'm more than happy to do that. They can reach me through my email address at drcraigchildress@gmail.com.
Thank you so much, Dr. Childress. I appreciate you taking this time.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you.